Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of eSIG. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on eSIG. For those of you not familiar with eSIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. I also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power Systems Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and scale. eSIG leads one of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. More information on the GPST can be found at www.globalpst.org. We've stayed quite busy this past year in spite of the virus constraints. Our most recent activity was our annual Fall Technical Workshop in October, and our next major activity is our annual Spring Technical Workshop being held online during the month of March. Our workshops and monthly webinar series are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the eSIG website. If you're new to eSIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we have moved to the Slido platform, and we're asking you to ask your questions through Slido at slido.com. You will not be able to ask your questions through WebEx. You need to go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG26 as the event code, ESIG26. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. You will see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to save 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the end and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, so today we're kicking off a 3-part webinar series dealing with the 3 P's of transmission, those being planning, permitting, and paying. The first in the series is on transmission planning. Based on registrations, it looks like this will be another very popular one. The webinar will feature Rob Gramlich, founder and president of Grid Strategies. Rob is a familiar face to many of you and has been working in this area for quite a while. Rob is a well-known figure nationally and will cover the drivers for a broad geographical approach to planning. In his role at Grid Strategies, he also provides leadership to a number of clean energy organizations in Washington and is a member of the eSIG Advisory Council. He also served as the economic advisor to FERC Chairman Pat Wood and as a senior economist at PJM. I feel very fortunate to have Rob here with us today. On a personal note, as I have gotten in the habit of doing, I took a look on LinkedIn last night. I'm always interested to know how many friends the speaker and I have in common, and I found out that we have 311 shared connections. Rob, I looked through them, and it was like looking back through the pages of a history book. Anyway, I've worked with Rob for about 15 years. I consider him a good friend and a good friend of eSIG, and it's a pleasure having him here. The webinar today will focus on the existential threat that the lack of adequate transmission plays in the expansion of clean energy and decarbonization. It will plant the seeds for some ideas about what the next FERC, along with DOE, ISOs, and states, can do to put new transmission planning policies in place to build the transmission needed for the future. Just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com with the event code of ESIG26 to ask your questions. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Rob, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, hear you good.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here I have so many good friends in this ESIG community, and looking at the numbers piling up on this, it's really extraordinary. So it's great news that we're getting more interest and talent in this area. The only problem with it is that now the secret of ESIG is out, and I'm going to lose my edge quickly. I've always considered it my secret weapon, and I get armed with so much good information from these meetings that are now online and free to so many people. But that's a good thing. We need a lot more help and talent in this area. So why don't we dive right in? I'm going to go through a set of slides, some of which are just saying transmission is important, and I think most people know that. So I'm going to try to get to the last slide, which gets into better ways to do transmission planning, and love to have Q&A, comments, or any kind of discussion on that, and we'll just hang on that last slide on the screen as we have that conversation. So get your questions and comments ready. But here we go. Let's dive through a little whirlwind of the transmission view of the world as we see it here in Washington, and it's a new environment in Washington. For example, we have a new climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, who said recently to respond to the challenge of climate change, we need ambitious investments in our electrical grid. So you can see the full statement on the screen, but I think you may have heard President Biden talk about transmission in one of the town halls, and I think a lot of the team have been very well exposed to these issues, as well as new FERC commissioners. So I do think once we kind of get to that area, we're only less than a week into the administration. I do think we're going to start seeing some things on transmission. The importance of transmission, most people here know, but just to kind of summarize, it's threefold. Most people know about the remoteness of the high quality wind and solar resources, and if we're going to do this decarbonization and renewable development cost effectively, we've got to access those better resource areas, 88% of that being in the 15 central states. Fewer people know, but the ESIG community will generally recognize that you also need to balance power systems by moving power back and forth. I'll say more about that in a minute. And transmission supports weak parts of the grid as generators retire and system inertia declines. So it's not just the remoteness. There are other factors that drive transmission when you're talking about a grid that's a majority renewable energy powered. And to say a little bit more about that, it's power back. I emphasized here with the underline power moving back and forth. So we need to move tens of gigawatts within and across regions. You can look at many examples of this. I just pulled up this morning the Pacific DC intertie. Here we are, the 50th anniversary of the Pacific DC intertie, and you can see how 2,500 megawatt swings back and forth within a daily basis is how solar energy moves from California up to the north, and then hydro moves back down in the evening. So we see that in actual operations. And then on the right, the famous interconnection seam study from Nrel. You could see with the high VG variable generation scenario, you get more power back and forth. And this is also a daily cycle you can see with solar energy moving to the eastern interconnection, and then mainly during the day, and then wind moving back to the west. So we're not just getting remote energy; we're moving power back and forth in order to balance systems on a daily basis. I could stare at these types of graphs all day. This is Chris Clack, Vibrant Clean Energy, just to highlight certain areas with a high renewable penetration grid. You really do have to worry about those multi-day periods without much wind or solar. This is a winter period, and particularly in the northern climates, you see the red is solar. You don't have quite so much solar in Minnesota in the winter, and there can be a few days where the wind dies down. So what you need to do in part is import energy, and that's the beige in this graph. So this region, had a little wind lull, but if you have transmission, and you have inter-regional transmission in particular, then you can import power from the other region, and the next month or week you might be exporting to the other region that needs it. And that's again, how we should expect a future grid to operate in a very high renewable energy scenario. This same point is what you would call a resilience or reliability factor. So it's not just efficiency, sharing resources, but when FERC opened up, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission opened up a big proceeding on resilience a few years ago. The context was whether additional support was needed for baseload units. Well, the response actually came back from the grid operators who are responsible for keeping the lights on, that actually it's really transmission that's the key for resilience. New York ISO said this about expanding into regional interconnections, and then ISO New England spoke about moving power around without dependence on local resources. The National Academies of Sciences had a report on resilience. Actually, current FERC Commissioner Clements was part of that study a few years back, talking about how opportunities to plan and design the system to reduce the criticality of individual components can help with resilience. And of course, the way to do that is with more transmission. So again, it's an important resilience factor as well as efficiency and as well as renewable energy or climate-driven purposes. Looked at from a different way, from the perspective of generators trying to get onto the transmission grid, those developers of those projects, what they see is a very long backlog to get connected. They see 734 gigawatts of generation in the queues ahead of them. Almost all of that is renewable energy or storage. And the problem is, each one tries to connect and they have to wait, and then they get a transmission cost estimate for a network upgrade charge, and they really have no way to predict whether that's going to be a high or low number. So they get back a number. If it's a high number, they'll probably drop out of the queue, and then the RTO has to go back and restudy everybody else, and it's this never-ending do loop of a process. We just wrote a paper on this issue for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. It's on the website there, along with my partners Michael Goggin and Jay Casberry, going through the details of that. And it's a real problem. There are some things FERC can do and RTOs can do within the interconnection process, but really it's an infrastructure issue. Really, better transmission planning is needed. We've sort of reached a point in a number of these regions, and on this slide here you can see the costs going up about fourfold for the network upgrade costs being assigned to these generators. And so we've sort of reached a point where there's a limit, and assigning the costs or doing the study on a generator by generator basis or a cluster by cluster basis really doesn't work. Really, we need to do a proactive plan to the known resource areas and build the efficient size and scale of transmission to access these areas. So if we think bigger about transmission, there's been a number of studies lately. I mentioned the interconnection seam study from Nrel, and there's a little update to that on the bottom left that it looks it kind of adds the Northeast and an offshore network. The upper left is just an Eastern interconnection study alone. You can see the width of the purple lines being the size of the capacity that needs to move back and forth. You can kind of see it going down into Florida, and you have that same dynamic where surplus solar would be imported out of Florida during the day, and then wind from other regions would be sent back down to Florida at night. So again, it's power moving back and forth over the capacity, not just in one direction. The top right is the Renewable Energy Future study from Nrel. The bottom right is this new study from a couple of MIT researchers, Brown and Potterwood, with the width of the black bars there being the gigawatts of power transfer. So again, we're talking about tens of gigawatts of transfer. And if I could tell policymakers one thing, it would be that we need to find ways to move tens of gigawatts of power with within and across regions for a renewable energy-driven grid. I mentioned offshore. This picture here shows the offshore wind lease areas. So this is mostly happening in the Northeast, but also the West Coast now is being seriously looked at. And you see a couple things here. Number one, you have this familiar dynamic of a remote resource that you need to proactively build transmission to access. But if you look closely, you often also notice that the strength of the transmission grid along the coast is pretty weak. For example, look at New Jersey. They want a lot of offshore wind, but most of their grid is on the western part of their state. So what that means is you need a lot of onshore grid, or people call it dry grid, in addition to the offshore or wet grid to access all the offshore wind. And there's, I think, 30 gigawatts in current state plans for offshore. And if you look at how those Northeast states might decarbonize, you're going to look into over 100 gigawatts of offshore wind. So again, proactive transmission planning is going to be needed there. Now, first, before we talk about very difficult issues around transmission planning, and I've been talking about the 3 Ps for a long time, as Charlie described: planning, permitting, paying. All of those are tough, particularly if you need new rights of way. The permitting is really tough. So and from a consumer perspective, cost allocation is very tough. So you're going to hear about those in future parts of this ESIG series. But it seems wise for everybody to first do the cheaper things. And one nice thing we have is some new technologies that are available that can deliver more over existing wires. So the new term of art from FERC is grid enhancing technologies. There are at least 4, a non-exclusive list of 4 that I'll mention in the next slide, but these grid enhancing technologies are generally very low cost. I mean, they're in the $1 million or a couple tens of million or well under that, but it's nothing like, a whole new line, and certainly not a whole new line with a new right of way and everything. Also, these are deployable in months. They're scalable, they're modular. You can actually redeploy and move them around in many cases. So they offer a lot of flexibility, and in many cases, they can deliver a lot more over existing lines. So the specific technologies here that I usually talk about in my role with the Watt Coalition, is a coalition that I started with the companies shown on the bottom, are advanced power flow control, dynamic line ratings, and advanced topology control. FERC also puts storage as transmission in that category of grid enhancing technologies, but all of these are basically able to deliver more over existing lines. Now, and so, it seems wise to sort of look at that first, but obviously that doesn't do everything. There are, as we saw in the last slide, there are some areas that just have no transmission there at all. So obviously you need some new infrastructure. Now I want to start turning to solutions of sort of how we've done it, and then some ideas on what to do going forward. And the first thing I want to say about that is that it's not rocket science. We know how to do it. It has been done before. In fact, almost 1/2 of the current U.S. wind industry is only there because of these proactive transmission planning exercises. There was an area of California that was first part of a specific plan, then it kind of got rolled into the whole network, but it was done in part with that resource area in mind. The famous Texas Competitive Renewable Energy Zone program brought almost 15 gigawatts of wind that wouldn't otherwise be connected. MISO multi-value projects was a very successful effort. SPP priority projects, similarly very successful, and then a smattering of some others around the country adds up to just about 50 gigawatts of the, we're somewhere over 110 gigawatts of wind installed in the U.S. So again, we can do this, and it has been done before. I get a little impatient with people who read about some permitting battle or read a book about it, even though Russell Gold's Superpower book is an excellent book. But when they come away saying, oh, it's impossible, that's really not right. One more slide on that topic. If you kind of look at these on the map, some of these large-scale build-outs, again, these were done, they were only a glimmer in somebody's eye in 2005, and then they turned into plans about 5 years later, and then most of them have been completed by now. There's a couple laggards who are just getting completed now of these plans, but they've been very successful with 3-to-1 benefit cost ratios, 2.5 to 3 to 1. And I said we know how to do this. There was basically a common winning formula for each of these efforts. It was proactive, multi-benefit planning with broad beneficiary pays cost allocation. A lot of people know that in ERCOT, they fully spread transmission costs across all users. I don't think they even try to do beneficiary pays, but in outside of ERCOT, in the area where transmission is under FERC jurisdiction, the law of the land as directed by the courts is transmission cost allocation needs to go roughly commensurate with beneficiaries paying. So that's sort of how that works, but it doesn't mean you have to bean count every electron. If everybody benefits a little bit from a high voltage network, and again, think back to those earlier slides with power flowing back and forth across regions. It's not just a linear radial thing from point A to point B. It's back and forth. FERC is able to spread costs more broadly according to that. But so that's the general formula, and I'll say a little bit more about what proactive and multi-benefit means in a minute. Now, luckily, we have an agency in Washington that is in charge of transmission. It maybe doesn't have all of the authority we might like, but the agency has been very active over the time of my career. In fact, my first job after graduate school was to go to FERC and help on Order 888. And each of these significant, sort of signature orders from FERC tried to advance regional transmission planning, coming out of a history of a more balkanized, siloed structure where a number of neighboring vertically integrated utilities had relatively weak connections between them. They sort of used those connections for reliability and some reserve sharing, but they weren't really designing the system for regional markets or regional power flows. So these efforts from FERC were largely driven to support competition in generation and open up wider geographic competition. And each one moved the ball forward in different ways. Happy to talk about each one. I took out the detailed slides on what each one of these did, but RTGs was general encouragement. Order 888 was open access with some requirements to build in response to customer requests, as well as some principles for independent system operators. Order 2000 encouraged regional transmission organizations, which had as a key function regional planning. Order 890 put some teeth into transmission planning. Order 1000 put further guidance and pushed for regional transmission planning that took public policy into account and pushed for inter-regional planning. Whether this worked or not is another story, but that was were attempted. And so here we are 10 years after the last one of those major initiatives with what I think anyway is a major gap between where we are and where we need to be. And so I'm hopeful that this new FERC with a new chairman and Rich Glick and new commissioner and Allison Clements and Mark Christie will devote the time to take up this action as a priority. I think some of you have heard now Chairman Glick make some statements about his interest in regional transmission in the past, and we've heard that from other commissioners from both parties as well. It was a bit of a resource issue because unavoidably this is complicated and it takes a lot of commission and staff resources. But I think we may be getting to a point where that could be taken up. For FERC to act in this area, and everything I'm saying here also applies to any individual planning authority, inside or outside an RTO. I'm a little bit FERC-centric here, based in Washington, but let's not limit our conversation to that. And what I'm talking about now is a reflection of at least where Americans for a Clean Energy Grid use the world. That's a group I work with. You can look it up. Again, we got reports on the ASEG website. In fact, we have a webinar tomorrow with all 9 former FERC chairs, those that are not currently serving, from both parties to talk about what FERC could do in this area on planning. So these 2 slides here are, this one's sort of about the infirmities we have right now, and the next slide is about suggested reforms and solutions. So as we see it right now, there are almost no interregional lines being planned. So kind of the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, and for all of the good efforts, there's really not much being done. Now, I recognize that some of the RTOs have started working together better, and I really appreciate what some of the state commissions, including the Organization of MISO States and SPP, Regional State Committee, are doing in that area, but we're still not there yet in terms of interregional lines. Certainly nowhere near what those earlier slides with a macro grid would call for. Also, we have a lot of factors about the evolving resource mix, consumer demand, public policies, and interconnection queues, which are really not being considered. If you think about typical utility planning, you sort of factor in expected load growth, knowing that there's uncertainty. Nobody really knows what load will be in the future, but you make your best guess and you factor in a load forecast. There's a whole cottage industry in load forecasting. I used to work in that area. Well, similarly, when you're doing transmission planning, you would think, it seems common sense to us that you should take your best guess at what the resource mix will be 10, 20 years out, and the location and types of generation, additions and retirements. And you have some pretty good sources of information like that, for that, like state laws, like utility goals. Almost all utilities have decarbonization goals. And yet the transmission planning processes are generally not incorporating that. Sometimes they consider it as a scenario. So you ask an RTO plan and they'll say, oh yeah, we had that in our scenario. Well, that's the scenario. That's not the plan. We need this stuff in the plan. There's a very tricky issue about the competitive processes that we're not going to answer here. But to some extent, there have in some regions with voluntary RTOs, the whole competitive process puts the RTO in an impossible position on that. So something needs to be worked out there about whether utilities get to build or competitive processes are to be used. Narrow purpose planning currently reigns, and that's a problem. We have sort of reliability goes in one bucket, economic or congestion reduction goes in another bucket. Connecting projects in the interconnection queue goes into a third bucket altogether. So that sort of leads, if you look at any one of those needs, usually the benefits and costs don't pencil out. But if you put them all together in what I was saying before, the multi-purpose, or as MISO called it, multi-value project approach, then things pencil out. You can sort of value stack transmission by putting the various benefits together to see if the overall benefits exceed the cost, or if you get overall net benefits. And then the current process is also reactive, not proactive. Again, I don't think the planners are generally doing nearly enough to look out into the future at the evolving resource mix. and actually incorporate that information into their plans. And all these resource areas where all these projects are stuck in the queues, you just have these projects sitting there. It might take them 3 or 4 years to get all the way through the process because they're in this resource area that's largely disconnected from the grid and the process. You're essentially trying to build a shared network through the interconnection process, which is a terrible way to design a transmission system. Really, we should be proactive and designing proactively, building the transmission out to the resource areas. And then now we're getting wonky enough for an ESIG webinar here, deterministic versus probabilistic. Ben Hobbs and others in the ESIG meeting in the past have shown the additional value to transmission if you look at it on more of a probabilistic basis rather than sort of a single point estimate deterministic basis. Transmission provides a lot of optionality, and that should be taken into account in the analysis. And we also have an unusual situation. The last point here is that almost all transmission being built right now is local, on the local utility systems. And I think the reality is just it's easier to do that, and there's not nearly as much interaction with the regional and interregional processes there. There should be, and as there was even just 10 years ago, before some policy changes were made. So I think we need to get back to building the larger scale regional and interregional transmission that's really not happening right now. So this is the last slide, and look forward to people's comments and questions. I can see on Slido they're starting to come in. So after this, I'll turn it over to Ryan or Charlie to manage that. But these are a set of recommendations, obviously tied directly to the last slide about the infirmities. But what we're going to put out tomorrow for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid is to recommend that FERC undertake a new comprehensive rulemaking, and again, also recommend that any RTO or planning authority do this on their own with or without FERC. And those changes would include the following items. First of all, multi-benefit planning, which is de-siloing. Incorporate public policies, don't just consider them. We had a little bit of a fight about that 10 years ago where the rule ultimately said to just consider them. So, it's easy for planning authorities to go meet with their neighbor and, have a meeting in a hotel and say they've considered it, and that's about it. Incorporate utility resource plans. Again, when we have stated resource goal or utility goals about what their decarbonization or renewable energy targets are, that should be incorporated. Likewise, consumer resource plans. There are a lot of large energy buyers out there who are demanding renewable energy for their own portfolio, and there's information on what those goals are. That also could be taken into account in the planning process. Generator interconnection queues, obviously are not determinative because nobody thinks the 734 gigawatts in the queues will all be built, but it's a very good source of information about the location and types of generation and the level of market interest in certain areas that could be taken into account. And so planners could do sort of what the ERCOT CREZ planners and the MISO MVP planners did, which is look at those resource areas, call them zones if you want, and plan to access them. Also, electrification is something that's knowable, can be estimated. Nobody knows for sure, but certainly many of the estimates show a very big amount of electrification and a very significant increase in electric load coming from that, so they should also be incorporated. Carbon regulation estimates, the default is essentially to assume that there will be no carbon regulation ever. I don't think that's a good assumption. I don't think anybody would invest their own money on an assumption of effectively zero carbon price. So something should be assumed. Not that there's any correct number, but something should be assumed there. And then multi-region RTO process. We've had a process difficulty called the triple hurdle problem with RTOs in neighboring regions trying to do interregional planning. So there are ways to get more common models and more common processes for planning across areas to improve the interregional planning. There's been bills in Congress directing FERC to improve interregional planning. Those have not passed yet. They still could, but there's a wide recognition that that's an issue. And then take into account congestion reduction. That's sort of standard fare, but one of the benefits that should be taken into account. Take into account efficiencies across scenes, both one-way delivery and back and forth improvement to joint dispatch. Take into account resilience, like through low probability, high impact scenarios. How much would PJM want to import from MISO with a polar vortex situation, or how much would California benefit in the next large, widespread heat wave from getting transmission and energy from farther away. These scenarios, when they're incorporated, usually lead to increased value for transmission. And then on the probabilistic versus deterministic, incorporate either just through scenarios or through actual probabilities. Incorporate that into planning. And as I mentioned, grid operations, so grid enhancing technologies, incorporate that into plans as well. And then finally, benefit cost analysis. I think much more can be done with that. We always have to be, make this work for consumers. Personally, I believe that the scenario of accessing and sharing energy across regions is far cheaper than the excessive local building you would have to do because generation is so expensive. And so, transmission, if you're assuming a high renewable scenario, then transmission benefit cost analysis usually comes out in the black for good, well-planned lines. But you should do it. You should go through the exercise and make sure, and we need to make sure that consumers see that they're not paying for things that are not needed. So I think there's more FERC can do. We suggest in this paper we're releasing tomorrow some different ways to do that. And then I'll just close. Charlie mentioned beyond FERC and RTOs, I think there are some other players in this world on transmission planning. I think a lot of useful analysis could be done by the Department of Energy and the national labs, and that can hopefully be done in partnership with RTO planners and in partnership with FERC. But that analysis and that stakeholder engagement that DOE is very good at providing, I think could be really useful, and all that analysis that the national labs could provide. And then, of course, there's a lot of regional groups, whether it's Western Governors Association or the various regional state committees. These groups of states, I think, can be much more engaged in planning processes. I would love to see them get some support, whether it's from Department of Energy or elsewhere, to be engaged and perhaps get some technical support so they can be well equipped to participate in these proceedings. But planning is a big thing, and it affects many people and many stakeholders. It's not just kind of an insider thing with the engineers, but we need to engage all the right people in these processes. So it's bigger than RTOs, it's bigger than FERC, and I think we could sure use some help from others, from states and other agencies at the federal level on planning. So Charlie, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to Q&A.
Okay, thanks for a very thoughtful presentation. A lot of good ideas in there. Before we start drawing from the Slido comments, let me just ask you one that kind of immediately follows up on your last slide there. And that's just an opinion about how much can be accomplished with the current legislation and regulatory framework that's in place, and how much do you need new legislation to get the job done?
Well, I think a tremendous amount can be accomplished with existing authority, perhaps more in this area than other areas of government. If you're following Washington closely, you're starting to learn about just what things can pass under reconciliation rules and what can pass without a change in the filibuster rules and all of that. And the short summary of that is there's a lot of things that really you can't see getting passed with in terms of new legislation. So there's definitely going to be a premium again on what the government can do without new legislation. And as I said, I think FERC has a tremendous amount of authority. Our paper we're releasing tomorrow goes through the authorities in the previous court cases and interpretations and all of that to do a lot of this and make sure RTOs and planning authorities are doing best practice planning. Now on your 3 Ps, and I know your future panelists in this series will talk about this more, but on paying, you could, well, first of all, you could see actually something like an investment tax credit getting passed because that could actually go with 50 Senate votes rather than 60. But even without that federal government or taxpayer support, FERC has a lot of authority over cost allocation. So I think FERC could do a lot on the planning and the paying. And on the permitting, there's a very good paper from Sam Walsh and Avi Zevin, part of the Columbia University and NYU effort on what the Biden administration could do in that area. I agree with 95% of that paper. Now, they're basically saying the government has some limited federal backstop siting authorities and should use them, and that's I think that's right. I'd love to see the administration say they're open for business on utilizing those authorities in certain circumstances. Now, even if they did that, they only go so far. The authority is not that broad, so it's not going to change the world in terms of siting. It's certainly not making electricity like the natural gas pipeline regime with federal siting. It's still going to be largely state and local approvals, which are definitely going to be a challenge for new rights of way.
Okay, what could potentially happen there? All right, let's look at some of these questions here coming in through Slido. There's a couple that are related. So the first question and the fourth question that I see. Perhaps Rob can comment on Biden's energy plan and impact on transmission system in the U.S. And then what efforts are underway. Where did that go? What efforts are underway to make the new agency heads aware of the critical need for national planning and support for expanding transmission at national level? Somewhat related. But.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we need to wait and see what the Biden administration says about transmission. Again, President Biden made very positive comments at a town hall during the campaign. I think you could look at a number of the individual people who have been appointed to different positions in the White House or Department of Energy and find a lot of supporters and people who I think would largely agree with a lot of the points here. But, those are individuals and they're not, so far they haven't spoken on behalf of the administration. And I and everybody else has thrown in ideas to the transition team and to the campaign and everything, but we haven't heard yet what's going to come out on the other side. So I think we just have to wait and see. I would say I'm very optimistic. I would say it's a very talented group of people who I think get it and have their heads and hearts in the right places. But we're only 6 days into the administration, and they're extremely disciplined, I think, in this administration about not leaking things out before they're ready to issue their statement. So there will be some announcements tomorrow. I'm hoping to see transmission somewhere among those announcements, but I don't know. If we don't see it then, hopefully there'll be more opportunities in the not too distant future.
Okay. One on right-of-ways. Maybe it's a little more pertinent to the next webinar on permitting and siting, but any thoughts on how we can more effectively advance the planning of transmission lines along existing right-of-ways like highways or rail lines to deal with local opposition?
Yeah, well, I've been intrigued with this possibility because I think we need all options to move forward. This is hard enough that and uncertain enough that we don't know really what's going to work. I've heard some promising signs about railways. You have one entity that largely controls the whole right of way, and they have reasons to want and benefit from transmission. It doesn't need to interfere with their operations. I've also, heard challenges about just how far away the lines need to be from the rail. I don't think there's any federal authority that could sort of force that to happen. I think it's up to the railways. FERC issued a report in this last year about the opportunities and challenges for this. It probably could have gone into a little bit more thorough assessment than it did, but it is something being discussed. Highways are interesting, especially when you kind of think about the interaction potentially with transportation and charging stations. But those are, of course, tough too. State departments of transportation control those rights of way. There's like a whole industry that lobbies to prevent any commercial use of anything actually in the right of way, and so that would need to be overcome. But this is one of those things where with presidential leadership, like imagine a presidential executive order on a variety of issues related to transmission, including asking the Department of Transportation to seriously promote these opportunities and be open and remove any roadblocks. That could help a great deal, and who knows where it would go.
Yep. Some unexplored territory there. Hopefully they'll get explored. Here's one on the DC overlay, Rob. Give you a chance to offer some opinions on the overlay, maybe. How does the DC overlay grid align with current market constructs? And are we expecting load-serving entities to purchase multi-gigawatt imports from the spot markets?
Yeah, Anonymous asks a great question there. Both parts. First of all, I'll say HVDC has a bright future because we're talking about very long distances, and the economics of the new HVDC technologies really does look good. I would also say no serious plan I've seen is exclusively DC. I think there's a lot of AC that always goes along with it. So I think the future of HVAC is also bright. And then the second half of this question is a tough one. Is kind of the key issue, which is who's the customer. That's largely the challenge with all these merchant projects that are out there. There's a dozen or so that are out there. Some of them have permitting challenges, and you tend to read about those. But what you don't read about quite so much is, who exactly is the off-taker? Who's the long-term customer willing to sign up for a capacity reservation for 10 to 20 years to help them, pay for the line? And that's a general issue we have in electricity overall. We have the same issue in generation, finding these long-term contracts and customers. But it's an issue. For example, we had a webinar recently with the heads of the power marketing administrations. It's on the ASAG website if you want to listen. And they have programs for helping build transmission. The TIP transmission infrastructure program, I think, for WAPA. They don't have a lack of borrowing authority. What they do have a lack of is customers on the other end willing to sign up for those lines. So the situation with those is the same. So again, that's the problem. Now, in theory, if you had a really strong national regulator, you could do all of that HVDC and transmission planning on a more of a planned and regulatory basis, not a merchant basis where the developer has to go around and pass the hat to get money. Personally, I think it's a lot more efficient if you can do it on a planned basis, like we saw with that formula for MISO MVPs and ERCOT CREZ. You roll it into the transmission rate base and you allocate the cost to ratepayers, rather than, again, having to pass the hat and find customers willing to take 10 or 20-year commitments. So long answer, but there's some key issues there.
Yeah. Okay. The next question that's on the other devices, the GETS. Are there any best practice roadmaps for GETS forming in the U.S.? Seems like utilities are spinning wheels on needing R&D funding and pilots. And I would just, I guess, add a little bit to that, that you're seeing a lot of new technologies need for demonstrations, and every utility, it seems, wants to have his own demonstration to convince himself that it works. What's the prospect, you think, of doing a demonstration, letting a lot of people see the results, and then saying, okay, the demo is done, let's move ahead with commercial operation?
Yeah, no, I mean, those are all good points. Grid enhancing technologies are really commercially ready. They don't need to be proven again, although I don't object to the next utility doing another demonstration so it can be comfortable with it, right? We've both worked with enough transmission operators to know that they're very conservative, and they want to sort of feel and touch it and see how it works on their own system before they do any kind of widespread deployment. So I'm not anti-pilot project, but we absolutely need more than that. These technologies are ready to go. They are going in other countries that have different incentive structures, like the UK and Australia. It's just that in the United States, we have a particular formula for regulatory planning that leads basically most utilities to say, you know what, I have no problem. I'm happy to, experiment with some of these, but I don't benefit from it. So why would I spend a lot of time? And we need to change that. There is a proceeding before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to change those incentives to make it not a disincentive for utilities to deploy jets. And so I'm hopeful that FERC will follow through with that. Chairman Glick is now in charge of the agenda, and he has spoken many times publicly about his interest in grid enhancing technology. So I'm hopeful that something will move forward there soon. And for any of the utilities on this call, I would look carefully at that and consider whether your utility might benefit from deploying some of these technologies.
Okay. A couple of detailed questions here from Rajat Pangalia. We'll take part of the first one. How can the disjoint between transmission planning and interconnection request studies be addressed to propose a queue reform? I think you touched on that, but maybe a little more insight.
Yeah, well, I really, again, hope that each RTO and FERC undertake broader transmission planning to kind of incorporate queue issues, interconnection issues into the planning process. So, again, we're not trying to build a regional shared network through an interconnection process, which is just no way to run a railroad. There is one specific reform in that interconnection paper I mentioned that is sort of short of that. It's an intermediate step, and that is on the cost allocation. It seems to me and to us at ASEG that charging the generator exclusively through what's called participant funding for the next shared network upgrade that may be needed for the next generator or cluster in the queue is not fair because, again, it's by definition part of a shared network and others are benefiting from it. So it's not that generators should never pay, but it's also not that generators should exclusively pay. And the reality is FERC does allow the exclusive generator payment. It does allow participant funding in the RTO areas, and that's a problem. That's something FERC could fix. That's something each RTO could fix. And I think should, not to the exclusion of the broader transmission planning reforms.
Okay. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Skip the next one and go down to Anonymous. How utilized is today's grid? Are there opportunities to improve the use of the existing system before spending billions on grid expansion efforts? I think you touched on this also. That's got a lot of prongs, and it's related to a question further down about the cost of the grid expansion. And could you just give a little more color on that in terms of the cost and also the benefit to cost ratios?
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to meet this anonymous person. She seems really smart. But no, it's a question that comes up a lot, and it's a good point. I mean, certainly I've raised the issue in the context of grid enhancing technologies that the capacity utilization of much of the network is low, is under 50%. But that said, I mean, the capacity factor of many generators is under 10 or 20%, and they're needed. The capacity factor of my car is probably 2%, but I need it. The capacity factor of solar is whatever, 20%, and it's having a massive impact on a positive impact on the system. So sometimes those numbers are misleading. I think we just need to kind of put it in context of how other assets around the economy are utilized.
Okay. I know you didn't talk about it. If it's not something that you're comfortable with, we can skip over it. But there are a couple of questions related to the global interconnection plan. Renewables are producing energy somewhere on the planet. Does it make sense to have global transmission moving energy from where it's light to where it's dark? Really, really big, long HVDC lines.
Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about it. I've seen that, idea, and in theory, it's right. We're having a hard enough time getting neighboring states to work together. So I have. And continental, I mean, maybe I'll go as far as continental. One thing that I will say could be really important for United States decarbonization is, I think most people recognize that long duration storage is really important. And 4-hour batteries are really important, but they don't do 3 days worth of storage. But in Canada, the western part, central part, and eastern part have tremendous, terawatt hours worth of long duration storage, essentially water behind dams up there. So on a continental scale, a macro grid that incorporates and includes some of that hydro could be extremely beneficial as a balancing resource, and it does require a macro grid to get there. If we ever get to sometime in my lifetime talking about connections beyond the continent, I don't know. We got a while before we go there, I think.
Well, in fact, we're talking about them today. There's an activity going on in CGRE, the International Conference on Large Electric Systems. It's under Study Committee C1.44. That's pursuing cost-benefit analysis of a global interconnection, and it's led by RTE, the French utility, and it's got RTOs from all over the world that are participating in it. It's a high-level kind of thing, It's a little more than a back-of-the-envelope calculation. They're using the actual RTE simulation tools. But I think next year, maybe even later this year, there'll be some results, maybe a technical paper that'll come out of that'll be interesting to see. It's building on some earlier work that was done at an even higher level a couple of years before. So I guess I would say stay tuned for that.
Well, there you go. ESIG again, and Charlie on the cutting edge. So.
Thanks. I'm going to take one more question. I'm going to skip down towards the bottom, just looking around at something interesting and give you a chance to talk about the supergrid a bit. Which grids or RTOs do you expect or hope will be the first ones to be connected through HVDC lines? And do you think we'll reach a supergrid within a few decades?
Well, back to this last conversation, I live very much in the real world in Washington, and I think to some extent these issues are a process of getting a lot of people to think bigger and broader. So I'm sort of focused on spreading the general recognition that we need to move tens of gigawatts within and across regions, and you can't do it all with storage or batteries in your garage. We should do a lot, but there's a need to physically move power. I do think there are a lot of merits to the supergrid and the macro grid, and it's good to talk about that. I don't really think we have the institutions up to that yet, but we could. So it's going to take some time and more analysis. And I know ESIG is going to have a white paper pretty soon on large scale transmission, and I think we need some more input and visions of what it might look like, and then we can start talking about, okay, who does what. So I think we've got a ways to go, but I sure hope we get there in a couple of decades. I think we need to.
Yeah, I hope so too. Okay, so we're about at the top of the hour, so we're going to need to wrap it up. And as I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll answer the questions we didn't get to and get the answers posted as quickly as possible. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the transmission series, which will be held on February 9th at 2 p.m. Brett Sumner of Beatty and Wozniak will be speaking on transmission permitting. Our next webinar in the GPST series, remember the GPST, will be held on February 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern. Christian Schaefer of AEMO will be speaking on their work on developing an engineering framework to support Australia's energy transition. We hope you'll be able to join us once again for one or both of these events. Further information on all of our webinars and meetings can be found on our website at esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails, and you're all invited to attend. Rob, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, very interesting, and thank all of you for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again in February. In the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. Bye for now.
Thanks, Charlie. Goodbye.